The cargo plane sat on the tarmac in Entebbe, Uganda, its engines running. Inside were over 100 hostages, most of them Israeli, held by Palestinian and German terrorists who had hijacked their flight days earlier. Outside, Ugandan soldiers loyal to dictator Idi Amin guarded the airport, protecting the hijackers. It was July 4, 1976. The hostages had been separated, Jews on one side, non-Jews on the other. The terrorists had demanded the release of dozens of prisoners held in Israeli jails. If their demands weren't met, they would start executing hostages. Israel was 2,500 miles away. The airport was defended by Ugandan military forces. Any rescue attempt would require flying that distance undetected, landing at a hostile airport, neutralizing both terrorists and Ugandan soldiers, rescuing over 100 hostages, and flying home before Ugandan fighter jets could respond. Military analysts considered it impossible. The distance was too great. The variables were too many. The risk of catastrophic failure was overwhelming. But Israeli planners saw something others didn't, a narrow window of possibility, created by audacity, surprise, and meticulous preparation. Within 90 minutes, Israeli commandos would storm the terminal, kill the terrorists, evacuate the hostages, and escape before Uganda could respond. The operation would become legendary. But it was just one of many times that Israeli intelligence and special forces executed missions that others considered impossible. This is the story of Israel's most daring intelligence operations. Missions that required infiltrating enemy territory, operating behind hostile lines, and achieving objectives that seemed beyond reach. Operations that succeeded not because they were easy, but because Israeli operatives were willing to attempt what others wouldn't even consider. Israel's geography has always dictated its intelligence doctrine. Surrounded by hostile neighbors, outnumbered, with no strategic depth, Israel couldn't afford to fight defensive wars. Threats had to be identified and neutralized before they reached Israeli territory. This reality created an intelligence culture focused on offensive operations. Not waiting for threats to materialize, but going after them wherever they existed. It meant operating in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, and beyond. It meant taking risks that larger, more secure nations would never accept. The philosophy was simple: better to fight on enemy territory than wait for enemies to bring the fight to Israel. This led to some of the most audacious intelligence operations in modern history. Operation Entebbe, as it became known, began on June 27, 1976, when Air France Flight 139 was hijacked shortly after leaving Tel Aviv. The hijackers, members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and German revolutionary cells, diverted the plane to Entebbe, Uganda, where they received support from Ugandan dictator Idi Amin. The hijackers moved the hostages into the old terminal building and began their demands: release 53 prisoners held in Israel and other countries, or hostages would die. Non-Israeli passengers were released, but 105 remained, mostly Israeli Jews. The terrorists had imposed a deadline, July 4th. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin faced an impossible choice: negotiate and release terrorists, setting a precedent that would encourage more hijackings? Or attempt a military rescue that might result in all hostages being killed? The Israeli Defense Forces began planning. Major General Dan Shamran oversaw the operation. Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu commanded the lead assault unit. The planners had one advantage: Mossad had intelligence that the old terminal at Entebbe had been built by an Israeli construction company years earlier, and they still had the blueprints. They built a full-scale mock-up of the terminal and rehearsed the assault repeatedly. The plan was insane in its boldness: fly 4 C-130 Hercules transport aircraft 2,500 miles to Uganda, land at Entebbe in darkness, storm the terminal, kill the terrorists, rescue the hostages, and fly home before Ugandan forces could organize a response. On July 3rd, the aircraft took off from Israel. They flew south along the Red Sea, then across Ethiopia, avoiding radar by flying at extremely low altitude. As they approached Entebbe, they maintained radio silence. The lead aircraft landed first, rolling to a stop near the old terminal. A black Mercedes and Land Rovers rolled out of the cargo hold. The Mercedes was identical to those used by Ugandan officials. The convoy drove toward the terminal, hoping to pass as a visiting dignitary's motorcade. Ugandan sentries saw the vehicles approaching and hesitated, confused. That hesitation was fatal. Israeli commandos shot them and rushed the terminal. Inside, the terrorists were caught completely by surprise. Netanyahu's unit burst through the doors, shouting in Hebrew and English for hostages to get down. They killed the terrorists in seconds. But Ugandan soldiers in a nearby barracks began responding. A firefight erupted outside the terminal. While the assault team secured hostages, other Israeli units destroyed Ugandan MiG fighter jets parked at the airfield to prevent pursuit. Engineers placed explosives. Within minutes, the hostages were being loaded onto the C-130s. Netanyahu was hit by Ugandan fire during the assault. He would later die from his wounds, the only Israeli commando killed. 3 hostages also died in the crossfire, but 102 were rescued. Within 90 minutes of landing, the Israeli aircraft were airborne, flying home. The world was stunned. Israel had executed a hostage rescue 2,500 miles from home, at a hostile airport, with minimal casualties. The operation demonstrated capabilities that few nations possessed and fewer would attempt. But Entebbe was not Israel's first impossible mission. Years earlier, Mossad had conducted an operation equally audacious, though far less publicized. In the late 1960s, Israel faced a strategic problem. Egypt had received advanced Soviet MiG-21 fighter jets that were superior to anything in the Israeli Air Force. Israeli pilots needed to understand the MiG's capabilities, its strengths and weaknesses, to develop tactics for defeating it in combat. But how do you study an enemy aircraft when the enemy won't let you examine one? You steal it. Operation Rooster 53, as it was codenamed, began with intelligence gathering. Mossad identified an Egyptian air base where MiG-21s were stationed. They recruited an Egyptian engineer at the base who provided detailed information about security procedures, flight schedules, and aircraft maintenance. Israeli planners decided to actually steal a MiG-21 directly from the Egyptian base. The operation required inserting a helicopter deep into Egyptian territory, landing at a military airfield, stealing the aircraft, and flying it back to Israel while the pilot's helicopter escort provided cover. In 1966, Israeli intelligence made contact with an Iraqi pilot, Munir Redfa, who was Christian and felt discriminated against in Muslim-majority Iraq. They convinced him to defect, bringing his MiG-21 with him. Redfa flew his aircraft at low altitude across Jordan, evading radar, and landed in Israel. Israeli test pilots immediately began studying the MiG. They analyzed its performance characteristics, its turning radius, its engine limitations. They developed tactics specifically designed to exploit its weaknesses. When war came in 1967, Israeli pilots used those tactics to devastating effect, shooting down dozens of Egyptian and Syrian MiGs with minimal losses. But Israel wanted more than just to study enemy weapons. They wanted to prevent those weapons from being developed in the first place. In the 1960s, Egypt, with help from German scientists, was developing ballistic missiles that could strike Israeli cities. Israel couldn't attack the facilities directly without provoking war. But they could eliminate the scientists. Mossad began Operation Damocles, a campaign to intimidate or eliminate the German scientists working on Egypt's missile program. Letter bombs were sent. Scientists received threatening messages. Some were convinced to leave Egypt through intimidation. Others were eliminated. One scientist, Heinz Krug, disappeared in 1962 and was never found. Another, Hans Kleinwachter, was badly injured by a letter bomb. The daughter of another scientist was injured by a car bomb intended for her father. The operations were ruthless and morally ambiguous. Israel was targeting scientists who were not combatants, using methods that some considered terrorism. But Israeli leaders argued that preventing the development of weapons that could kill thousands of Israeli civilians justified extreme measures. The campaign succeeded. Most German scientists left Egypt. The missile program was significantly delayed and ultimately failed to produce weapons that threatened Israel. The message was clear: working on weapons programs against Israel came with personal risk. Perhaps no Israeli operation was more technically audacious than Operation Opera in 1981. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, was building a nuclear reactor near Baghdad. The reactor, called Osirak, was being constructed with French assistance and was intended, publicly, for peaceful research. But Israeli intelligence concluded that Iraq was using it to develop nuclear weapons. Israel faced a strategic decision: allow Iraq to obtain nuclear weapons, potentially threatening Israel's existence, or destroy the reactor before it became operational, risking international condemnation and possible war? Prime Minister Menachem Begin authorized a military strike. The challenge was immense. The reactor was nearly 1,000 miles from Israel, beyond the combat radius of Israeli fighter jets without refueling. It was defended by anti-aircraft batteries. And it was located near Baghdad, where Iraqi air defenses were concentrated. Israeli planners developed an audacious solution. 8 F-16 fighters would bomb the reactor, escorted by 6 F-15s for protection. They would fly at extremely low altitude across Jordan and Saudi Arabia to avoid radar detection. They would strike in late afternoon when French technicians working at the site would have left for the day, minimizing casualties. On June 7, 1981, the aircraft took off. They flew in tight formation at low altitude, appearing on radar as a single commercial airliner. Saudi and Jordanian air defenses detected them but assumed they were a scheduled passenger flight. The strike lasted less than 2 minutes. The F-16s dropped precision bombs directly on the reactor dome, destroying it completely. Not a single bomb missed. All aircraft returned safely to Israel. The French technicians had indeed left for the day. Only one Iraqi soldier was killed. The international reaction was harsh. The United Nations Security Council condemned Israel. Even the United States, Israel's closest ally, criticized the attack. But years later, after the 1991 Gulf War revealed the extent of Iraq's weapons programs, opinion shifted. Israeli intelligence had been correct. Saddam Hussein had been pursuing nuclear weapons, and Operation Opera had delayed or prevented that program. If you're seeing how Israeli intelligence combines audacity with precision to achieve the impossible, make sure you subscribe to WarRoom Intel. We're breaking down operations that changed history and revealing how modern intelligence really works. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Now let's look at Israel's most secret operations. One of Israel's most closely guarded secrets for decades was Operation Moses and Operation Solomon, the airlift of Ethiopian Jews to Israel in the 1980s and 1990s. Ethiopian Jews, called Beta Israel, had lived in Ethiopia for centuries but faced persecution and famine. Israel wanted to bring them home, but Ethiopia was hostile to Israel and had close ties with the Soviet Union. Refugees couldn't simply be flown out. Instead, Mossad orchestrated one of the most complex humanitarian operations in intelligence history. Operation Moses began in 1984. Mossad established a fake diving resort on the coast of Sudan. The resort was actually a front for a rescue operation. Ethiopian Jewish refugees who had fled to Sudan were secretly transported to the resort, then evacuated by Israeli aircraft and Navy boats that arrived at night. The operation was run by Mossad agents posing as resort owners. They had to maintain the fiction that they were operating a legitimate business while secretly moving thousands of refugees. Between November 1984 and January 1985, over 8,000 Ethiopian Jews were rescued. The operation was exposed when word leaked to the media. Sudan, under international pressure, shut it down. But years later, in 1991, Ethiopia agreed to allow direct evacuation. Operation Solomon airlifted over 14,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel in just 36 hours, using every available aircraft in the Israeli fleet. The operations demonstrated that Israeli intelligence wasn't just about eliminating threats. It was also about protecting Jews worldwide, even when that required extraordinary logistics and deception. But perhaps the most sustained intelligence campaign Israel has conducted is its effort to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. For decades, Israel has operated inside Iran, conducting sabotage, assassination, and cyber warfare operations designed to delay Iran's nuclear program. In 2010, the Stuxnet computer virus, believed to be jointly developed by Israel and the United States, infected Iranian nuclear facilities. The virus caused centrifuges enriching uranium to spin out of control, destroying themselves while reporting normal operation to monitoring systems. It set Iran's nuclear program back by months or years without firing a single shot. Israeli operatives have also conducted assassination operations against Iranian nuclear scientists. Between 2010 and 2012, at least 4 scientists involved in Iran's nuclear program were killed in operations bearing the hallmarks of Mossad tradecraft. The assassinations were condemned internationally but sent a clear message: working on Iran's nuclear program carried personal risk. In 2018, Mossad conducted perhaps its boldest operation inside Iran. Israeli agents broke into a warehouse in Tehran that contained Iran's secret nuclear archive, thousands of documents proving that Iran had lied about its nuclear weapons program. The agents loaded the documents into trucks and smuggled them out of Iran. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu later revealed the operation publicly, displaying the captured documents as proof of Iranian deception. The operation demonstrated that Israel could operate inside Iran's capital, penetrate secure facilities, and extract massive amounts of material without being caught. These operations against Iran represent a decades-long intelligence campaign conducted across multiple countries and using every tool available: cyber warfare, assassination, sabotage, and espionage. Whether these operations will ultimately prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons remains uncertain. But they have delayed the program significantly and demonstrated Israeli capabilities that Iran must constantly account for. Israel's intelligence operations are not without controversy. Some operations have involved assassinating individuals in foreign countries, raising legal and ethical questions. The use of forged passports and the involvement of foreign nationals have created diplomatic incidents. In 2010, Mossad agents assassinated Hamas operative Mahmoud al-Mabhouh in Dubai. The operation was caught on security cameras, revealing how the team had tracked al-Mabhouh, entered his hotel room, and killed him. The exposure led to international criticism and the expulsion of Israeli diplomats from several countries. But Israeli officials argue that their operations are necessary acts of self-defense in an asymmetric conflict. Israel faces enemies who use terrorism, hide among civilians, and operate from countries that protect them. Targeted operations, while controversial, are viewed as preferable to full-scale military conflict that would cause far more casualties. The debate over the ethics and legality of these operations continues. But what's undeniable is their effectiveness. Israeli intelligence has prevented countless attacks, eliminated key enemy operatives, and maintained strategic advantages that have been critical to Israel's survival. The common thread through all these operations, from Entebbe to the Iranian nuclear program, is audacity. Israeli intelligence succeeds not because operations are easy, but because operatives are willing to attempt what others consider impossible. Flying 2,500 miles to rescue hostages. Stealing enemy aircraft. Bombing nuclear reactors. Airlifting thousands of refugees from hostile countries. Breaking into secure facilities in enemy capitals. Each operation required accepting risks that more cautious intelligence services would reject. But Israel's strategic situation has never allowed for caution. Surrounded by enemies, outnumbered, with limited room for error, Israel's survival has depended on being willing to take risks that others wouldn't. This culture of audacity is deeply embedded in Israeli intelligence and military institutions. Officers are trained to think creatively, to challenge conventional assumptions, to ask not, "Can this be done?" but, "How can this be done?" Failure is accepted as a risk of attempting difficult operations. Caution that prevents action is seen as more dangerous than boldness that risks failure. The operations described here are the ones that became public. But intelligence sources suggest they represent only a fraction of what Israeli intelligence has conducted over the decades. Many operations remain classified, their details known only to those who planned and executed them. What's clear is that Israeli intelligence operates with a level of boldness that few other services match. Whether targeting enemy weapons programs, rescuing hostages, or protecting Jews worldwide, Israeli operatives have repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to attempt missions that conventional military wisdom would dismiss as impossible. The legacy of these operations shapes how adversaries view Israel. They know that Israeli intelligence can reach anywhere, can penetrate secure facilities, can operate in hostile territory with sophistication that makes detection difficult. This creates deterrence, forcing enemies to assume they are vulnerable even in places they consider safe. For more stories of intelligence operations that changed history through audacity and precision, subscribe to WarRoom Intel. We investigate the missions that seemed impossible until someone attempted them. What operation should we cover next? Let us know in the comments. The most daring operations are not always the ones that succeed. Sometimes, boldness leads to failure. But Israel's willingness to attempt the impossible, to accept risk in pursuit of strategic objectives, has defined its intelligence operations for over 7 decades. From Entebbe to Tehran, from Ethiopian refugee camps to Iraqi nuclear facilities, Israeli intelligence has operated on the principle that survival requires offense. That waiting for threats to materialize is more dangerous than going after them wherever they exist. And that audacity, combined with meticulous preparation, can achieve objectives that seem beyond reach. These operations have saved lives, prevented wars, and maintained Israel's strategic position in a hostile region. They have also raised ethical questions and created diplomatic challenges. But they demonstrate what's possible when an intelligence service is willing to push boundaries, challenge assumptions, and attempt missions that others consider impossible. The lesson is not that boldness alone guarantees success. It's that boldness, combined with preparation, intelligence, and skill, can achieve outcomes that caution never could. Israel's most daring operations succeeded not because they were easy, but because they were well planned and executed by operatives willing to accept extraordinary risk. That combination has made Israeli intelligence one of the most capable and feared in the world. And it ensures that when threats emerge, Israel will continue attempting operations that others consider impossible, because its survival has always depended on achieving what seems beyond reach.